The train doors opened, and families had only seconds before their lives changed forever. At Auschwitz, Josef Mengele stood on the platform deciding who would work and who would die. Trained as a physician, he became obsessed with genetics, especially twins. Thousands of prisoners passed through selections he supervised. Survivors described children being separated from parents and taken into experiments that had nothing to do with treatment. Records suggest around 1.3 million people were sent to Auschwitz, with more than 1 million dying there. After the war, Mengele escaped Europe and avoided capture for decades. What makes his story so disturbing is that he used the authority of medicine not to heal, but to justify suffering on an industrial scale. The patients arrived desperate. The donors arrived even more desperate. Amit Kumar built one of the largest illegal kidney trafficking operations ever uncovered. Recruiters targeted poor laborers, promising life-changing payments that often never arrived. Wealthy recipients reportedly paid between $20,000 and $40,000 for transplants, while donors received only a fraction of that amount. Investigators estimated that hundreds of illegal kidney removals were linked to the network. The operation stretched across multiple cities and involved forged documents, brokers, and corrupt intermediaries. For years, it operated in plain sight. When police finally raided properties connected to the scheme, they uncovered a system that had turned human organs into a multi-million-dollar business. From the outside, Unit 731 looked like a research facility. Inside, it became one of the darkest chapters in medical history. Shiro Ishii oversaw a secret Japanese biological warfare program during World War II. Prisoners were exposed to deadly diseases, extreme conditions, and invasive procedures without consent. Historians estimate thousands died inside the facility itself, while biological weapons linked to the program may have contributed to far larger casualty numbers. Entire laboratories were dedicated to studying how disease spread through the human body. Medicine became a weapon. Years later, many details remained hidden, making the true scale difficult to calculate. The horror came not from chaos, but from organization. Families believed their loved ones had been buried with dignity. Investigators later discovered many had not. Michael Mastromarino ran a scheme that illegally harvested human tissue from corpses and sold it into the medical supply chain. Bones, tendons, and other tissue were removed using forged consent forms and falsified records. Thousands of body parts entered circulation through the operation. Medical companies purchased material they believed was legitimate. The business generated millions of dollars before authorities exposed the fraud. When the scandal became public, families learned that bodies entrusted to funeral homes had been treated as inventory. It became one of the largest tissue theft cases ever uncovered in the United States. The procedure could take less than 10 minutes. The consequences lasted forever. Walter Freeman became famous for promoting the transorbital lobotomy, a procedure performed by inserting an instrument through the eye socket into the brain. During the 1940s and 1950s, he performed more than 3,000 lobotomies. Some patients became severely impaired. Others lost major parts of their personality, memory, or independence. Freeman traveled across the country demonstrating the procedure publicly and often performed multiple operations in a single day. At the time, many saw him as a pioneer. Today, critics view the lobotomy era as one of medicine's most troubling examples of confidence outrunning evidence. A teenager entered the hospital after a traffic accident. What happened afterward triggered years of controversy. José Luis Gomes da Silva became one of the central figures connected to the Pavesi case in Brazil, a scandal involving allegations surrounding organ transplantation and declarations of brain death. Investigations, court proceedings, and media attention followed for years. Families questioned whether proper procedures had been followed before organs were removed. The case generated national headlines because it touched one of medicine's most sensitive areas: trust. When transplant systems function correctly, they save lives. When doubts emerge, even legitimate procedures can come under intense public scrutiny. Patients trusted him completely. That trust helped hide one of the deadliest medical crimes in modern history. Harold Shipman worked as a family doctor in England for decades while secretly killing patients under his care. Investigators ultimately linked him to at least 215 murders, though some estimates suggested the true number could exceed 250. Most victims were elderly women. The scale shocked the country because Shipman appeared ordinary. He wasn't operating outside the healthcare system, he was operating inside it. His crimes led to major reforms in death certification and medical oversight across the United Kingdom. Prisoners gave him a nickname that survived long after the war: Dr. Death. Aribert Heim served at Mauthausen concentration camp, where survivors later described brutal medical abuse and lethal procedures. Witnesses reported injections and operations performed without concern for human suffering. After World War II, Heim vanished. For decades, he remained one of the world's most wanted Nazi fugitives. International investigators searched across multiple countries while rumors of his location continued to surface. The manhunt lasted longer than many of his victims lived. His disappearance turned him into both a war criminal and a ghost. The promise sounded unbelievable. Thousands believed it anyway. John Brinkley claimed goat gland transplants could restore youth, vitality, and fertility. Patients traveled long distances and paid substantial fees for procedures lacking scientific support. During the 1920s, Brinkley built a fortune worth millions of dollars and became one of America's most famous medical personalities. He used radio advertising to reach enormous audiences and turned medicine into marketing. As scrutiny increased, investigators and regulators challenged his claims. The empire eventually collapsed, but not before countless patients spent money and hope chasing treatments that never worked as promised. The Pavesi scandal involved more than one individual. Alvaro Yanez became another prominent figure linked to investigations examining transplant procedures and organ removals. Court cases and public hearings kept the story in national headlines for years. The controversy fueled debate about medical oversight, documentation standards, and declarations of brain death. Families demanded answers. Hospitals faced questions. Even people with no connection to the case began wondering how much trust should be placed in systems they could never personally observe. The scandal's impact extended far beyond a single operating room. Warnings followed him from hospital to hospital. Somehow, he kept finding new opportunities. Michael Swango worked in multiple medical institutions despite repeated concerns from colleagues. Patients experienced unexplained illnesses. Co-workers reported suspicious incidents. Over time, investigators connected him to poisonings and murders. While only some deaths could be proven in court, authorities believe the total number of victims may have been significantly higher. His case exposed weaknesses in communication between institutions. Concerns existed, records existed, yet the system repeatedly failed to stop him before more patients were harmed. Karl Klauberg searched for a way to sterilize large populations quickly. Inside Nazi concentration camps, he carried out experiments on prisoners, particularly women, without consent. Thousands were subjected to painful procedures that caused permanent injury, infertility, and lasting trauma. The goal was not treatment, it was control. Klauberg believed medicine could be used to reshape populations according to ideology. His work became one of the clearest examples of how scientific expertise can be corrupted when ethics are removed from the process entirely. One account transformed a surgeon into a whistleblower. Enver Tohti later publicly described participating in an organ removal procedure involving a prisoner who, according to his testimony, had not fully died at the time. The story became widely discussed in international debates concerning allegations of forced organ harvesting. Supporters cite it as important testimony. Critics dispute aspects of the broader claims. Regardless of the political controversy, the account attracted global attention because it described a moment where surgery, state power, and human rights appeared to collide in a deeply unsettling way. The offer sounded like salvation. During World War II, Marcel Petiot promised desperate people safe escape routes out of Nazi-occupied France. Victims paid for forged identities and transportation they believed would lead to safety. Instead, many never reappeared. When investigators searched his property in Paris, they discovered evidence connected to dozens of deaths. Estimates vary, but authorities linked him to at least 26 murders, with some believing the true number was higher. Petiot used the chaos of war, the trust associated with medicine, and the desperation of refugees to build one of France's most disturbing criminal cases. The final chapter of the Pavesi controversy involved multiple investigations, legal battles, and years of public scrutiny. José Luis Bonfito became one of the surgeons associated with the case as authorities examined whether medical procedures had been conducted properly. The controversy generated national attention because organ transplantation depends heavily on public confidence. Every successful transplant requires trust between doctors, patients, and families. When that trust is questioned, the effects reach far beyond a single case. The scandal became a lasting reminder that medicine depends not only on skill, but also on transparency and accountability.